Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Bonnie Clearwater. I'm the Director and Chief Curator of NSU Art Museum, Fort Lauderdale. And we are actually not the presenter of this program, but we were happy to host it for Art Fort Lauderdale in their Art Discourse program. And when the organizer of Art Fort Lauderdale asked if I would moderate today's program, I was delighted because this is a subject that I have actually worked on for my entire career, starting in the early 80s. So this was just a perfect opportunity to really delve into a really fascinating and important subject. So I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Ashley James. Ashley is Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the Brooklyn Museum. There she's curated at the Brooklyn Museum the presentation of the exhibition Soul of a Nation, which focused on Black artists from the 1960s and 70s in America. And she has just curated an exhibition that opened at the Brooklyn Museum of Eric and Mack, Let Me Walk Across the Room. Prior to this position, she worked at the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Museum of Modern Art, where she was a Mellon Research Consortium Fellow, assisting in the 2018 Charles White and the Adrian Piper retrospectives, both of which I saw, and these are wonderful. Ashley has a PhD, she is a PhD candidate in the departments of African American Studies, English Literature, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. She holds an MA and MPhil in English Literature and an MA and MPhil, wow, you've been busy, in African American Studies from Yale. At Yale, she co-curated the 2014 University Art Gallery exhibition, Odd Volumes, book art from the Alan Chazanoff collection. She writes broadly on modern and contemporary literary and visual arts practices, and her dissertation reconsiders the relationship between politics, art, and Blackness in the late 1960s, early 1970s. She was listed as top young in the list of the top young curators to watch for 2018 by Cultured magazine. So we're here ready to watch you and to hear what you have been up to. Let's, first of all, you have such a varied journey that brought you to curating. So can you talk a little bit about your background and how you got to be where you are today?
Thank you. Thank you so much for being in conversation with me. It's a pleasure to be here at NSU. And yeah, it's just been a great trip, so thank you all. So yes, I have an unconventional curatorial background. I am receiving a PhD in literature, and with Soul of a Nation specifically, and kind of doing all kinds of interviews for the show, I've had to grapple with that question a lot. How did you get here? How did you move from literature to art, visual art? And as I was telling Bonnie when we spoke earlier this week, I think that part of it had to do with my own educational background, coming from being a product of public schooling primarily, and having parents who were so far from the visual arts in terms of their own careers, and having, I think, what many young students first kind of foray into the humanities is by way of English. Everyone takes English courses, not everyone takes art history courses, and I think for anybody who's humanities inclined, that becomes your first way of kind of seeing yourself as having a career in the arts. And then I think it really wasn't until I got to college, and it was actually by way of journalism, because I was covering exhibitions that were happening at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I went to Columbia undergrad, and I was writing stories about it, and then I kind of just was interested in the history of it, and then I slowly began kind of thinking about art. And then when I started my PhD, I began to take courses in art history, write about art, and at the Yale University Art Gallery, they have this amazing program that allows students to curate shows. It's really unparalleled and visionary, really. Jock Reynolds.
Yeah, I was going to say it was under Jock.
Yeah, as the former director of Yale, and that was my first experience literally curating art and seeing that this could be something that I can do and potentially thrive in. Yeah.
Well, it's great, and particularly with your focus, you were the right person to be take part in presenting this exhibition, Soul of a Nation, which very curiously was organized by Tate Modern in London. This survey of Black American art from the 60s and 70s is curated in London by British curators, by the way, and comes here, went to Crystal Bridges first, and then it's been at the Brooklyn Museum. It's about to close in another week or
1
two.
week, yeah.
And so, first of all, tell us a little bit about this exhibition, and then, well, tell us about the exhibition first.
Cool. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Cool. So, Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, focuses on the work of primarily Black American artists working between 1963 and 1983. So, it begins, at the what is considered the tail end of the Civil Rights Movement into the Black Power movement, which is considered to have begun in 1966. Through Black Power and the decline of Black Power, and it features 67 artists, over 150 works of art, quite expansive. At the Brooklyn Museum, it takes place over 2 floors, which is something that we don't generally do. Just to give you a sense of the scope of it, it's just a huge show, which is partially getting at that question of the British context and then the move to the U.S. because many museums can't accommodate just the sheer amount of material. So it really is meant to be a kind of survey of what artists were making during a kind of unparalleled time in history. Historians and myself don't believe in kind of exceptional periods, but I think that what is so resonant about the Black Power period is that the 1960s and 70s was this time when it wasn't only Black Power as the kind of an urgent movement that was happening during the time, but it was also the second wave feminist movement, it was the environmentalist movement, it was the anti-Vietnam War movement. And so you have this intersection of so much social and political change that artists are really called to account for themselves and their practices. They're made to kind of rise to the occasion of the moment, and I think that is what is so resonant about this period. You really see just kind of bold, new art-making practices.
But it's amazing that it took a British museum to do this. Now, when the show came to Brooklyn, again, as we said, it was organized by British curators in a British, a London museum. Did you find that you had to adjust it for the New York audience and the American audience?
Yes. Yes, and the London origins aren't so curious to me. I can see how that appears to be an odd origin story for this exhibition. But in fact, I mean, even your own track record, Bonnie, this show comes out of the work of so many curators and scholars who have attended to this period. Especially there's been a kind of uptick in interest in the 1960s and 1970s in the last decade, I would say. And so this show really feels like it almost feels natural to me because so much attention has been paid and the groundwork laid that even internationally people are looking at what happened. Like that to me is the success of the work that scholars have put in towards these artists. And then in bringing the show to the nation of the title, and New York specifically, it was an opportunity for me to just be a bit more specific about the history. So that meant that I mentioned the show is 2 floors. And the first floor is organized regionally. So in the tape presentation, regions are a kind of thread of the show, but here at Brooklyn, I kind of brought it to the fore more prominently, thinking that American audiences have a better understanding of American geography than an international audience would, and can kind of understand the specificities of regions more fully. So as an example of that, let's see. This is the Los Angeles section, and you see the Los Angeles section compared to this is Chicago, and get a sense of really the ways in which regions are not the only way we can understand art, but can provide a kind of context for the works that artists were making during this time.
One of the things I did find refreshing, because my career has taken me pretty much all over the country, and I enter it in the late 70s, early 80s, so I caught the tail end of it, but I was aware of how things were developing in different parts of the country, and I thought that what is refreshing about the show is it's not New York centric. Mm-hmm. It does show how, even if there's some commonality in the work, that it grew up in response to localized events, mm-hmm. And in different ways in each city, and I thought that was really interesting.
Definitely. Yeah. All of art history is super New York centric, American art history, and that, I mean, is it the majority of the show? Especially when you get to the second floor, it is kind of majority New York artists, but I do think that a regional layout at least allows you to understand the ways in which New York wasn't the only context.
Well, and especially the catalog, the essays, and we do have it in our shop downstairs. I highly recommend. This is going to be the source for future research on it. That it does break it down regionally, so that makes it so it might not be borne out so much in the exhibition, but mm-hmm. definitely in the research mm-hmm. and the catalog.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing is, American art in the 1960s and 70s in general was dominated by abstract art. To paint figuratively during that period was not advancing art history. There was this belief, it's hard to believe now, but in the 20th century there was a strong belief that art had to progress, and progression meant that you moved from figuration to abstraction, and once you made that advance, you couldn't go backwards. It was impossible to go backwards. Mm-hmm. But within the African American and Black art community, and there's even a bigger schism between abstraction and figuration. Can you address that issue?
Sure. The second floor, I mentioned that the show is 2 floors, and the second floor really takes up this question of abstraction and figuration, the tension between the two, and all the variations within. Really asking this question about artist responsibility, and for some, let's see, there were artists like William T. Williams, who's pictured here, and perhaps even more so Sam Gilliam, who's also downstairs in the museum right now, who are making headway in abstraction. And then the narrative goes that for Black artists, there was this sense of responsibility to the movement, and that responsibility required that Black artists paint Black figures with this sense that, let's see if I can find, this sense that the affirmation of one's self, one's body, one's image, particularly in the museum, was the way that an artist can contribute to the movement. So you have this kind of dialogue where you have certain abstract artists who don't want to paint figuratively but feel like they need to paint figuratively to be relevant. And then you have figurative artists who are feeling the weight of abstraction and this sense that abstraction is where innovation is happening. But what's interesting about the second floor is that in addition to all of that, painting itself was kind of in flux and called into question during this period, because in addition to the political and social revolutions of the period, there was also an aesthetic revolution afoot in the 1960s. And this was the kind of the heyday of performance art, conceptual art, minimalist art, and painting itself was considered in some ways passé. Or dead, yes. And so there's that makes it an even more kind of entangled kind of history and dynamic, really, because that's how we get a Sam Gilliam removing the canvas from the stretcher and draping the painting. That is kind of the response to painting being dead and this desire to move beyond it.
I recently did a visit with Sam in his studio in Washington, and he actually has a story about how that happened. For the first time he did that, it was for an exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, and it was for the big rotunda, and which he was going to make murals for, paintings for. And the director at the time, Walter Hobbs, one of my heroes, said to him, I don't know how you're going to be able to get this big canvas going all around. And it occurred to him, if he took the canvas off the stretcher, that solved that problem. So sometimes it could also be a practical, but it does show the willingness to be experimental at that time. And actually I have him sandwiched between Nicolene Thomas, a younger generation of artists, and Frank Stella, who was one of his artists that he admired, and you could see him being a connector in both traditions. And
Certainly.
of course, Stella's work was all about problem solving, and you could see that Sam was trying to solve a particular problem, and it made this gesture. The idea of aesthetics also came up when we talked this week, and particularly the idea of a Black aesthetic. And can you talk a little bit more about, I think a really good example of that is the Chicago group of the Afri-Cobra group, which, by the way, is on view right now at my old museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art, MoCA, North Miami. So you have an opportunity to see this. But let's talk about a development of an aesthetic.
Sure. So coming out of this period as well, along with the Black is Beautiful movement, Black Power movement, was this discourse around the Black aesthetic, and if there could be a Black aesthetic, something that's specifically, in some cases, African American, in other cases, diasporic, just depending on who's articulating that vision. And this show shows the ways in which artists either aligned with the vision of a Black aesthetic or refused it. In the case of Afri-Cobra, this is a collective of artists from Chicago who really did come together and determine that they could name the specifics of a Black aesthetic. It's hard to see with the lights here, but super bright colors, which they called Kool-Aid colors. And by the way, COBRA is an acronym for Commune of Bad Relevant Artists. So they were strident and a bit humorous too in their approach. Images of what they called Black heroes, so that was political leaders, but also just everyday people, women and children. They often integrated either letters or texts in their images, and with the idea being that you should literally embed a message in your work. And the Afro-Cobra group was very tied to community, the sense that art belonged to the community, it cannot be separated from the community, it served the community. And in fact, a number of the artists that began Afro-Cobra participated in another collective called Opusy, which made the Wall of Respect in Chicago, a mural that was a foundational mural on Chicago's South Side that served as a community gathering space for members of the South Side. And again, you see the Black heroes there. It's difficult to see, but musicians, actors, writers, political leaders. So again, art is to serve the community, and that was a Black aesthetic for them as well.
It was also a period with the rise of conceptual art, in which whatever medium or materials the artist used informed the meaning.
Mm-hmm.
But even that becomes complicated. For instance, I just showed you the article by Lizetta LaFalle Collins that I published in a art magazine in Los Angeles in 1989, in which she talks about how there's a dilemma for Black American artists to incorporate folk traditions into their art, or pop images to their art. There was no such problem for Andy Warhol or Lichtenstein, or dilemma, but there is for the Black artists, in twofold. One was that at that time, there was also the belief that an authentic Black art was the outsider artist, or what was called outsider artist, the untrained, or the art of Africa. And therefore, it was more valued in curatorial circles, in the collecting circles, than the artists such as, Sam Gilliam was recognized early, in 72, he represents America for the Venice Biennale, but the idea of a artist who has gone through the art school and is working like other artists in abstraction or minimalism, or was not seen as authentic.
Mm-hmm.
So it does become another issue. We did a show. We one of the first shows I presented here was organized by Thomas Lax at the Studio Museum of Harlem, dealing with exactly this issue, called "When Stars Begin to Fall." The imagination in American South, and it juxtaposed artists who were outsider artists with artists who are more conceptual, who were appropriating these modes of working. Mm-hmm. So you touch on that subject as well. It's
Sure.
a complicated one.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about where that could come in relationship to Soul of the Nation. I mean, there's the LA artists, which
the LA artists, particularly like Betty Saar,
yes,
and Outer Bridge,
and Outer Bridge, Nora Purifoy, many of which, I mean,
because the article actually was written from the LA point of view. Lizetta was the director of the California African American Museum. So it was focusing specifically on the LA group.
Yeah, I mean, and the LA group, I guess their images look the most explicitly connected to a Southern folk tradition, in that, I wish there were close-ups here. It's rough materials, many of it's reclaimed. They were assemblage artists, so they believed in using materials that existed in non-art contexts and reconstituting them to make something new. But yeah, I guess I'm trying to find what a counterpoint to that could be. Because I think what is nice about the show is that it doesn't. Oh, you know what? We'll go to the first room. Artists, even the ones who aren't making sculptural work that reads folkloric, artists like Romare Bearden are drawing from the South in various ways that somehow has been able to breach the art folkloric divide. And I'm just working this out.
Think of the Theaster Gates that we have in our collection, where he's combined. It's a ceramic work. He was originally a ceramicist and loves working in ceramic, and it combines basically the face of something. It looks like an African mask on top of a vessel that's referencing the Dave the Potter, who was a former slave, who was a well-known potter in the South, and it becomes a syncretic image and a kind of reliquary combining these two by a conceptual artist. And it's interesting to see these younger artists using that as part of the meaning of the work, and it is filled with all these other associations.
Definitely. I mean, I think David Hammonds is probably another good example of someone who's
from the LA group.
From LA again, who's is certainly considered a conceptual artist, but is kind of drawing upon what some would think to be specifically rich African American cultural signifiers. I don't know if there's that's him in the back. That's David Hammonds.
Yeah. The other thing that I've observed with particularly the younger generation of Black American artists is their strong connection, reverence for history, and that it's either history, more of a general history of the experience, or it's the art history. And I recently did an interview with Iberia Simmons, and she said, first and foremost, the one thing she can never forget is she's a descendant of slaves, and that permeates all of her work. I was just in Washington this week for the opening of Glenn Ligon's exhibition at Georgetown, where it's again connected with literary history with James Baldwin and with the March on Washington. So that was another. It might and it comes out in different ways. So it's not a single aesthetic, but it's one of the things I think does permeate all the work.
Yeah, I definitely feel like we're living in a historical turn or archival turn, and I think maybe that's the result of more artists having access to history. So, as histories become cataloged, as more and more artists go to school for long periods of time, as more and more artists have backgrounds that aren't just art backgrounds. I have a number of friends who received degrees in all kinds of other non-art contexts, or just interested in history, then that comes out in the work. I can talk about the show that I just opened as a response to that, which is an artist named Eric Mack, who I thought of in relationship to Soul of a Nation, because the end of the show ends on this note of the suspended canvas. That's an artist named Joe Overstreet in the middle, where if we go back to what Sam Gilliam was doing with the suspended, sorry, I should have gotten this together more, canvas as well, Overstreet kind of takes that position and runs with it, really, and making a canvas that approximates a tent. It could be used. You could seek shelter under it. So again, this idea that painting can really infiltrate one's real-time space and life, as opposed to just something that stays on a wall and is separate from you. So I was thinking about an artist who's also interested in this idea, and so Eric Mack is a young artist who works at the intersection of painting, sculpture, and fashion. So he does these textile collages from found material. This is an aerial view of this kind of canopy that he's constructed. And the main painting is in fact this intersectional textile that he has dyed, which looks like painting from certain vantage points, but also really affects what is a kind of quirky space of the museum. So you are made to kind of walk around it. It's not opaque, so you can see persons as you move around the space. So this idea that painting, it's performative. Again, kind of thinking about Guillaume Overstreet and the performative potential of painting,
Right.
activating it, wanting to see its potentials for just everyday life.
Well, one of the things that I'm also finding interesting, is the shift in paradigm. As I said, the last 20 years of the art world were dominated by relational aesthetics, which was a form of conceptual art that engaged the viewer. In a way, this is part of it. But with the rise of reputations of artists like Kehinde Wiley, and which has helped reinvigorate portraiture and in general, not just endowed with that Black artist, but also we're seeing a reinvigoration of abstraction as a result of looking at these artists who were either under-recognized and now are coming to the fore. Think of the Met's recent show from their collection, Heroic Abstraction. It really was presented as a way of correcting history and abstraction, and the fact that these artists are bringing a new relevancy to abstraction. So I'm fascinated by that shift. In fact, I wrote about the impact of Kehinde Wiley on the revival of figuration in art in the Art Glackens Renoir book that's just come out. So there's a quote I love from Gertrude Stein, and she says, "For a long time, everybody refuses, and then, almost without pause, everyone accepts." In the history of the refused in the arts and literature, the rapidity of the change is always startling. Now, I've said I've been participating in the contemporary field since the mid-1970s. And I'm particularly working with emerging or under-recognized artists. And it always baffles me that artists who, supported very early, and it could all of a sudden they're an overnight sensation. Even working with Ed Ruscha in 1987 in LA, at a time that really no one was paying that much attention. Within 1 year, he was the big star all over the international art world, and he quipped, after 25 years, I'm an overnight sensation. And we're seeing that here, these artists in the 60s and 70s, having this kind of recognition, although they had been shown all this time, but now they've come to the focus. How do you account for this phenomenon? We touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, seasoned emerging artists. Actually this exhibition is hopefully the start of a kind of resurgence of an emerging artist program at the Brooklyn Museum. And we had that conversation of how do we define emerging, because you have in this instance a young artist like Eric who's, he's 30, 31. But then you have artists who have been working for years and years and, might be in their 60s and their 70s who haven't received the kind of critical attention. And is that emerging? And I think we decided, yes, it is, because it's in recognition of the fact that emergence is not tied to age, and it's so much a function of the trends of the art world. But in terms of the artists from Soul of a Nation, I think some of them are kind of finding their moment because of this interest in abstraction again, and recognizing that they were making specific strides in abstraction from very early on. I also just think it's kind of the oddity, the paradox of African American art is that, historical art, is that because of racism, segregated art practices, unlike, their white counterparts, there are so many masters who haven't had their moment yet. So it's kind of strange in that you can have this wellspring of exhibitions, catalogs, scholarship to be done on real masters of their work because of that lag, that delay. So I feel like because of the work of so many scholars who worked with different levels of visibility over the course of the last century, we're finally kind of seeing the chickens coming home to roost, or in a positive way, the yields of that foundation.
Yeah, and I think that also goes back to this idea of history, because the artists, they're more now mid-career artists, I'm thinking of, who have achieved a certain level of international recognition, and they have now the clout and the agency to bring attention to their mentors or the artists that they greatly admired. When I was with Sam Gilliam, I told him that I started taking note of the LA gallery on David Kordansky when he started showing Sam Gilliam's work, probably about 6 or 7 years ago. So I asked him, well, how did you in Washington, D.C. end up in this, basically it was a hip, up-and-coming gallery in L.A., and he said it was Rashid Johnson, mid-career, well-known now, black artist, who told Kordansky he should show him. And we also see this the other way with Micheline Thomas has been really good using her voice, her agency in bringing attention to young artists. And so I think that is also helping in this new mixture of bringing attention. And there's also the I think you could be well known in LA, but you might still be emerging in New York. Yeah. So we also look at that phenomenon. Okay, for one of the areas that has been really slow in catching up in our field is having more curators of color, particularly black curators, in the position of making decisions about what gets shown, who gets shown, and how. And Ashley, you are in the forefront of this and I think it is important that you've come from a background of literature as well as art, and you have all these multiple degrees that you really do need for this kind of approach. Can you just talk a little bit of how the field is changing from the professional side?
Yeah, I mean, it's invigorating to be amongst a young group of curators who are beginning to occupy these positions and have various levels of power. I don't have a lot of power, but I do credit my institution for, trusting me to take on Soul of a Nation and then, giving me the opportunity to do this project. And I feel like I see the effects of that, even if they're small. I'm trying to think of, I think about the Studio Museum as a space that has been doing that for a long time. Thelma Golden, who trained so many young curators to then move on and impact other institutions. I'm thinking of Lauren at Crystal Bridges, who also did Soul of a Nation, and the kind of real hope is that you learn enough to then impact these kind of wider stories. So it matters that she moves into a American curator role because now she has the history of her African American specific curatorial practice to then kind of place that in larger conversation with history writ large. And I think we're continuing to see. We're only beginning to see the result of those seeds being planted, and hopefully we'll continue to watch others, and including me, impact the art history in a significant way.
Well, I'm so glad that you came. I mean, she ended up being only here for one day, and it doesn't always rain like this, especially this time of year.
Well, I'm from California, but I don't like the beach, so I was like, this is fine.
Right. We're indoors anyway. But I should mention, this museum, NSU Art Museum, is celebrating its 60th anniversary. And one of the things we did for the 60th anniversary was really research its history, its evolution, and particularly its very strong collection. We have over 7,000 works in this collection. And right from the beginning, there was a strong focus on Black artists, of African art, of African diaspora, contemporary African artists, as well as a very strong women's focus, to the point that now I'm filling in the guys, which is very different than other museums. So for me, it was really important to have you here, and I do encourage you to go downstairs and look at the exhibition, which it really touches on all these topics that we talked about today, and it's so important to have, it's a really interesting period from an art historian's point of view, because we get to there's a reshuffling of the deck, and frankly, for doing this from the 70s to today, it's frankly, I'm saying, what took everybody so long? Because it was there. I think when I was at the Rothko Foundation in 81, one of the first things we did was make a grant to the alternative space in New York, called the Alternative Museum, of Herrera's. I just forgot her first name. Carmen. Thank you. Carmen Herrera's exhibition there, and I guess she was in her late 70s at that point, and she was being recognized as one of the most under-recognized artists of her generation. And they're still talking about her, and I think she's about 100 now, as the most important under-recognized artist. And yet, basically, the show at the Met, I think, was greatly built around the one geometric painting they have by Carmen Herrera in the show. So even she, luckily, has lived long enough to see the tides turn, and she's, after 100 years, an overnight sensation. We are happy to we have it in this intimate room, and we're happy to answer any questions about the exhibition, or what Ashley's doing, or what she would love to see happen in the future. Any questions? Well, okay. Okay, Christopher.
Yeah, I was going to say. So, is this exhibition? Where is it going to travel to next? Where else will we be able to see this? Are you considering different regions?
So I'm not involved in anything to do with this travel history. That's the tape, but it is traveling to LA. It's going to the Broad Museum, which will be nice because LA is another one of those heavily represented regions of the exhibition, and seeing that work in its own context will be great. So far, it has traveled to New York, Arkansas, LA. A Chicago venue would be great. But it's a big show. It's a huge show, and not many institutions can just have the resources to really take it on.
And it's kind of hard to join at the end of a tour because of loans.
Right.
But I think this shows a start, and that and even with the catalog, I kept saying, I wish these essays were longer, because there is so much more history that needs to be addressed. So let's look at this as a beginning, and hope that there will be a lot more. Already from you, it's led to this exhibition.
It has, and it has actually led to another exhibition that hasn't been properly announced yet, but we're having a Lorraine O'Grady retrospective
great.
opening in
Oh, I love her
2020.
work.
Who's one of the artists in the show, and that really came out of Soul-Emanation and conversations around the fact that she's another overnight kind of sensation. And another example of hopefully the museums and hopefully other institutions' missions of not only having these group shows, but giving the artists their own kind of solo moment to carry forth the work of properly accounting for their contributions.
And hopefully show from American curators on
Yeah.
this topic. Well, thank you all, and I know Ashley is planning on going to see the exhibition, so I'm sure she wouldn't mind. Don't be shy. Come and ask her a few questions when you're not in front of everybody else. Okay, thank you. We thank Art Discourse from Art Fort Lauderdale, and hopefully the weather has cleared up enough so any of you who are planning on taking their boat rides to the different destinations for the exhibition. It's quite unique, very different from having Art Basel Miami in a convention center. How nice to be out in the water here in Fort Lauderdale, the Venice of America. It's a little bit more like being in Venice and going to the Venice Biennale. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Good luck with all you here.